Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have back on the show Susan Greenhalgh, Senior Advisor on Election Security for Free Speech for People. Previously, was Vice President of Programs at Verified Voting. And she was on just a little while after the 2024 election to talk about issues that herself and some of her colleagues had raised about the election. Susan, nice to see you again. Thanks so much for being back on.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So look, I got to tell you, so many people has not stopped. People have been calling in, raising questions about the 2024 election. A lot of people were disappointed that nothing was done to alleviate their concerns. Like, the voters always want to be heard, and they want to know that if you're raising concerns about audits or recounts that needed, something to be done. So I wanted to start, before we talk about what we're going on now in the symposium that you and other organizations are doing coming up next month. You were on a little over a week after the November election. And I want to read a little about the letter that you co-drafted and co-signed with other experts, and it was the Kamala Harris's campaign. It said, "We write to alert you to serious election security breaches that have threatened the security and integrity of the 2024 elections, and to identify ways to ensure that the will of the voters is reflected and that voters should have confidence in that result." And then you go on to say the most effective manner of doing so is targeted recounts requested by the candidates. And you talk about states like Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Can you remind people, we don't have to go into great detail, but a summary, what was it that got you and the other experts' attention back then?
Yeah, so in general, we count our votes by computer. Most of the country counts votes by computer. Computers are inherently insecure because they're computers. Even though we've been led to believe that it's impossible, they're impenetrable, the facts are not do not really align with those representations that we've been told. But more importantly, that something that was completely overlooked was the fact that there were people allied with President Trump after the 2020 election that went into election offices in multiple states and took copies of the voting software that counts the votes in the Dominion systems, and they actually took possession of ES&S voting machines. Together, those two vendors count almost 70% of the votes in the country. And this happened in 2020, 2021, and even through 2022, that these were cyber security technicians that had been hired by attorneys for Donald Trump to go in and get access to the software. This was, as I said, across multiple states. And even though there were a few very limited criminal prosecutions that occurred, for example, in Colorado, there's one going, or there's actually two going on right now. In Michigan, there was no effort to understand the breadth of this scheme, to understand what they did with the software once they got it. This is the largest known election security breach in US history. And the Garland Justice Department did absolutely nothing about it. There was no effort to find out, as I said, what they were going to do with the software or to recover it. And I think that, and we were petitioning for some criminal investigation for this multi-state conspiracy, because it's like we say, if somebody were to go in and steal plutonium from a plutonium lab, you wouldn't want them just to prosecute the security guard that let them in and not worry about where the plutonium went. Because having access to this software can enable a compromise. Now, this is not evidence that there was compromise. We're not saying that a compromise happened. What we were saying is that the systems were far more they're vulnerable to begin with. They were far more vulnerable in 2024 than they've ever been in the history of electronic voting machines in the US because of these known security breaches. And yet, in too many states, we're just relying on the computer-generated count. And that's why we were calling for the Harris campaign to initiate recounts of the paper ballots to ensure that the counts were correct. And if there were errors, then they could be addressed.
Yeah, in that letter, continue on, you write, "We have no evidence that the outcomes of the elections in those states were actually compromised as a result of the breaches, but binding risk-limiting audits or hand recounts should be routine for all elections, especially when the stakes are high and the results are close." So did you ever hear any response whatsoever from the Harris campaign or anyone from the DOJ?
No. So as far as the DOJ goes, as I said, we had a campaign going on for the better part of 2 years before the 2024 election. And I did get one letter back from the FBI which was a completely nonsensical response that said, we can only come in and do an investigation if the state asks us to. And this was false on its face because, of course, if that was the case, the DOJ would never have gone in and prosecuted violations of the civil rights laws, or the Voting Rights Act, or investigated Michael Brown's murder and so forth. In addition to that, in the case of Georgia, which is what we were specifically focused on in that particular letter that they did respond to, the Georgia State Election Board actually did ask the FBI to come and investigate, and they ignored it. So the response from the FBI was disappointing, to be very generous. I did ultimately go and meet with agents at the FBI and try to get them involved, but they obviously did nothing. And in the lead up to the 2024 election, we also tried to reach out to Democratic members of Congress, any member of Congress that would be interested in hearing this, because hopefully all members of Congress are concerned about security for voting systems. But what we were told essentially was that we didn't want to discourage people from voting, because if they knew that there were security issues with the election system, that would then they wouldn't show up to vote, and that's why they wanted to keep a lid on it.
Yeah, I've heard that very issue said before, and it doesn't actually make sense to me, because if you alert people well in advance and you can say, look, we've addressed it, so everything's fine now, go out and vote, as opposed to, we're not going to look into it and we're just going to hope everything goes well. That's ridiculous to me. So the Harris campaign, to my knowledge, you tell me if I'm wrong, didn't request any recounts or audits. They conceded within a day of the election. That was the end of it. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So we'll never know. That's the big thing. No one calls the show, even to this day, who has issues about the election and says, I know the election was stolen, or I know there was fraud here, or there was fraud there. There's just questions and concerns they have. And we so wish that, like you were saying, I love the idea that recount should be routine in all elections, especially the presidential election, and they could be randomly picked by truly a random system in the battleground states, so that as many people as possible have confidence. I know there's certain people, they're never going to accept the results if they don't agree with it. That's life. That's usually people on the right, but they're not going to. But more and more, you want people to have confidence. So it takes us to where we have a 2025 election happening for governor in Jersey and in Virginia. Before we talk about 2026, any concerns for 2025?
I mean, that we have the same concerns for all elections, is that they're insufficiently checked against the paper record. There's been I'm sure you've heard the big movement. We're going to have paper ballots. We're going to have paper records, and this has come from both the right and the left. But that paper ballot is only good if you do the recount or the audit that you were just talking about. And we do have some audits in some states, but we've looked at them closely, and we have a report on that coming out shortly too, which is going to come out next month, that looks at how these audits are insufficient to really provide the evidence. That's why when you're talking about people need to have evidence, we need to have evidence affirmatively that the counts are correct, which means the routine recount, the routine audit that of the paper ballots that affirms that the computer generated result is correct. We don't want to just be trusting the computers without, trust but verify always.
Right. And that makes all the sense in the world. I'm chatting with Susan Greenhalgh, Senior Advisor on Election Security for Free Speech for People. Any developments, the election was only 6 months away. Anything happen between now and then that we may have missed in terms of issues of election insecurity or any kind of breaches involved in the 2024 election?
You mean specific evidence?
Yeah, anything specifically. That's what I'm saying, because we'll talk about the Rockland County lawsuit in a second. But I'm just you live in this space. If it doesn't make a headline, or if it's not like on page 2 or 3, I'm gonna miss it. So I just want to see if there's anything else out there.
Well, there regularly are problems, and people overlook them. So, for example, in 2024 in a primary in Utah, there was a mistake in the way the votes were being counted by the computer generated machine. It was so far off that the election officials recognized it, and they hand counted the paper ballots because they knew that the machines were counting incorrectly. There was in 2020 Two, there was a primary contest in DeKalb County, Georgia for city council member. The city council member was told that she lost, but she went back and she looked and she found in her own precinct that there were 0 votes recorded for her, and she knew that she and her husband had voted for her. So she demanded a recount of paper ballots. Turned out she won. This stuff happens a lot, but what we see is and maybe not a lot, maybe a lot is not the right, but regularly. And what we see, and I could go on, I could give you more, but we don't need to go down there. But the problem is that these instances it was caught because it was the results were so profoundly wrong. But if they're not so profoundly wrong, then will people notice? And they wouldn't. Those were not caught by the routine audits. What
That's
little
a great
routine
point.
audits we have, which are insufficient.
So for the paper ballots, they're only good if people do a recount. Like I live in New York City. We vote by paper ballot, then we put it into a machine and the scanner scans it and the paper ballot goes wherever it does. So if there's a recount, there is that paper there. And then that's important as opposed to just someone tapping a screen, which I imagine that is more ripe for irregularities or outright fraud if there's no paper whatsoever.
Well, if you don't count the paper, then they're exactly the same.
Okay,
If
right. So
you
if you got,
do actually count the paper, then you have that as the backup. That's your safeguard. That's your seatbelt you're putting on by counting the paper ballot. But as just as an example for the inadequacy of the audits, I'll just tell you, I'm a New Yorker too. In New York, they count 3% of the precincts after the election by hand,
oh,
and do an audit. However, if you or I were to try and get through public records any information about that audit, all you would get is a piece of paper that says that the audit was conducted and that any discrepancies that were detected were resolved. What that means, I have no idea. And so you have no idea of how many ballots were counted, how many were counted incorrectly, etc. And when they're resolved, what is they were resolved means. So that's another concern.
that's an
There's no
excellent
trans
point.
and if there's no transparency in the audit, there's no transparency in the recount, then what's the point?
Right. If your goal is to build confidence in our elections, you are not doing that by not giving people details about here's the recount, here's what we did, and there was a statistical discrepancy of X amount, 2 votes or something. You're like, okay, even if you extrapolate that out, it wouldn't have an impact. That would be good to know, right? It's unreal. So there's a lawsuit going on in Rockland County that people have brought up on the show, and I did some research. I looked into it, and the complaint cites numerous statistical anomalies in election results. And Rockland County is just outside of New York City. It's down here. It's over Bergen County in North Jersey, where I'm originally from. What can you tell us? I know that you said to me before we started that free speech for the people is not actually working on this, but you're monitoring it. What has stood out for you about this lawsuit that you can share?
Well, not unlike the instance I gave you in Georgia, there are people in this county or in certain precincts that have signed affidavits saying that they voted for a certain candidate, and the votes counted in the system do not reflect the same number of people that signed affidavits. So there is direct evidence, which is pretty clearly showing that something went amiss in the way the votes were counted. And like I said earlier, this is things get miscounted.
Right.
Not it's not completely anomalous for things to get miscounted. So I think it's great that they're trying to get to the bottom of this. If it shows other anomalies in the vote count other than in the Senate race, the specific issues where people have signed affidavits that's relates to the Senate race, but that they count all the ballots and see if there's any other anomalies in other contests, that's important. We need to know that. And what's concerning to me is that in New York State, each county has a Republican and Democratic commissioner, and if the two agree to do a recount and count all the ballots, they can go ahead and do it. They don't need a court to tell them to do it. So I don't understand why there's been so much resistance from the Rockland County Board of Elections to just say, "Hey, we have all the paper ballots. That's supposed to be our safeguard. Why don't we go back to that and make sure that the count is correct?" They could easily do that, or I would think that they could. So I don't know why they're not doing that, but good for smart elections for pursuing that in court.
Yeah. And just so people know, in the allegations, it talks about the in multiple districts, hundreds of voters chose Democratic candidate Kirsten Gillibrand, who was running for re-election for the U.S. Senate. None voted for Vice President Harris. So you had hundreds of votes for the Democrat and zero Vice President Harris. Now, Vice President Harris won New York. It wasn't close, but what is your reaction when you hear that?
I know that there are some political scientists and people familiar with the area and the demographics who have explanations for that. But those are just explanations. Those are after the fact explanations. The whole point of the paper ballot is to know how people actually voted. So why don't we look at the paper ballot and see how people actually voted? Because it does seem anomalous, but maybe there's an explanation that makes sense. But just look at the paper. Then we're not questioning it. Why not find out how people actually voted?
And this lawsuit is continuing right now. I saw that the judge in May ruled the allegations were serious enough for discovery to proceed. So this is going to take some time. And I don't know what the discovery is going to be. Just give us the ballots. And then we start counting them and we're like, okay, there's something bizarre here. If not, now people have called in and said, well, what if it turns out that, for example, the battleground state of Pennsylvania was actually stolen, that kind of thing. I'm not aware of any cure that you could remove Trump from office or have a new election. We are too far from that you can prosecute people for crimes, of course, but is there anything else that in terms of punitive measures or corrective measures that could be taken if, for example, there was found out that there was some widespread fraud?
I think the only remedy on the table at this point for something, I mean, I don't think you need that, but Free States for People is calling for impeachment of Donald Trump for other alleged unlawful acts. So I think impeachment would probably be the only potential way to remedy an unlawful president.
Yeah, and
or whatever the
right.
crime.
And we know where that's going to go because the Senate, but you can do it to get press if he was involved. I mean, if it was random people doing things, it's a different scenario. So we've got the midterm elections a little over a year from now happening. People call all the time and express great concerns that this election will not be fair, that it will be rigged, that somehow Republicans will steal it. And those are fair points people are making. I can't tell you it's not going to be. I'm concerned about it. Is there anything we can do, anything we could be doing now in terms of pushing elected officials, pushing people in states where they're not red states, they're not going to care. If they're red states, they're not going to care. But in, blue cities in a red state, like, is there anything more we could be doing now to prepare for this election to give people confidence and ensure that it's not stolen?
I think we have to destigmatize the idea of seeking recounts because candidates often don't want to get a recount because there's going to be a sore loser and they want to preserve their political future. And they owe it to the voters to know that the votes were counted correctly. And in most cases, the only party that actually has the rights to call for recounts are the candidates. So some states, their citizens can do it, but it's much harder, and typically it's the candidates that have to do it. So I think that we need to be understanding that our system is not infallible. We have been sold post 2020 in the big lie. There was, in my opinion, a really unfortunate backlash that people wanted to discourage the evidence-based evidence-free claims that Trump was making about fraud by saying our elections are basically impenetrable and they have no vulnerabilities. And that's not true either. We need to have a clear-eyed vision and understanding of where the vulnerabilities are and understand that we have safeguards that we can exercise, like paper ballots, like recounts and audits, and that the voters should be pressuring the candidates to understand that if there's any question, they should be pursuing every right to get a recount and count the paper ballots because we want to have evidence that the computer generated result is correct.
The point you make about ending the stigma of calling for a recount really resonates because I saw fellow Democrats after 2024 raising questions, and then other Democrats, when I know they were all Democrats because I know the people, were attacking them. You're just like MAGA, just like Trump, as opposed to let's see where the evidence is. Well, what are your concerns? It was a remarkable thing to see other Democrats trying to shut down fellow Democrats who were in good faith raising question. No one was saying there were briefcases filled with ballots snuck in. They were like, I have concerns about this or that. How did he win all 7 states? And there was all anecdotal evidence, but it should be addressed, I think, to give people confidence in the system. I don't know how we overcome that stigma, but I think you make a great point. And maybe it's got to be where, I don't know, would be state by state, where we're going to do a recount X amount of districts after every national election, after every federal election, and every big, they usually line up, except for states like Virginia and New Jersey, gubernatorial races line up with the other ones. But would you suggest doing something where there's a commitment right before the election? No matter what, we're doing a recount in X amount of districts that are chosen randomly from the computer or from the box, whatever, like a lottery thing.
Well, we do have some audits that are in states that are in place right now that kind of work along those lines. But like I said, they're woefully insufficient, and in many cases, they're not transparent. Like, so for example, in Pennsylvania, they do a statewide audit of one contest. And in 2024, they chose the state treasurer's contest. Now, why would they only choose that one contest and not choose the presidential or even the Senate race, which were both contested? So rather than kind of pursuing a rigorous audit, a meaningful audit, one that actually is going to give the evidence, I think sometimes we see election officials going the easiest route possible, the least controversial, the one that's going to be the least work. And that's what happened in Pennsylvania. So yes, we need those types of audits. We need meaningful audits. And if we don't get the audits, then we need the recounts. And I would just say one other thing, that I feel like part of the problem is that too much of the public has been fed a campaign and a steady diet of overstatements about election system security. The machines can't possibly be compromised because they're never connected to the internet. This is just the number one problematic myth, just because they're not connected to. So in some cases, the machines actually are connected to the internet because they have wireless modems. That's a whole problem. States like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Florida regularly use wireless modems that connect the systems to the internet. But there's other ways, there's other vectors that they can get compromised. We can have insider access, like we saw after 2020, when there were corrupt election officials allowing people access to their voting systems. There can be the vendors that provide the programming updates to the machines. There are ways to get into the system. So the idea that it absolutely can't possibly be compromised is just inaccurate. We also hear they're tested before the election, and that if there was any miscounts, we would know because we run a pre-marked DAC and say there's 60 votes for candidate A and 40 votes for candidate B. The results should spit out 60 for A and 40 for B, and then we know the machines are counting properly. But the truth is that if anyone has a sophisticated attacker is actually and that's good for programming, you should do that. We should absolutely do that. But if you're a sophisticated attacker who's designed malware, when the machines go through that test process, they're in test mode. And malware can be designed to lie dormant during test mode. And then on election day, because a computer has a clock, it knows what day is election day, it counts differently. So logic and accuracy testing, great idea. We're not going to do away with it, but it has its limits. It can't protect against that. So that's why we need to educate the public about and get back to ground truth about election system security. They are not being controlled by Nest thermometers from Venezuela and China, but they are vulnerable, and that's why we need to be counting paper ballots, and that's why we're holding this symposium to try and get back to ground truth about election system security.
And that brings me to the last questions about the symposium that Free Speech for People and the Election Integrity Foundation, EIF, are holding August 8th and 9th. And it's the idea of getting to the truth about elections. So tell people just a little bit about it. And we'll talk later on afterwards about it, because I'm really curious how it goes down.
So we're very happy to be partnering with Election Integrity Foundation, which is an organization that's been founded by some of the most renowned computer security experts that have studied election systems on behalf of election officials. So that includes like Dr. Matt Blaze, who did a security review of the systems used in Ohio, multiple systems used in Ohio some time ago. David Jefferson, who was a an advisor to 4 different California secretaries of state on computerized voting systems. So these are guys who actually had the ability to examine systems, understand how they work, and also know how elections are administered and what sort of protections, physical protections, and so forth are put in place. So they have that information as well. We're partnering with them for a 2-day set of speakers talks at the DEF CON Hackers Conference in the Voting Village. The EIF guys have been putting on the Voting Village for the last several years, which includes a speaker track. But this year we're trying to reorient the speaker track to be a little bit more friendly to democracy groups and people concerned about democracy, not so technical for experts only,
Right.
and to go back to that ground truth of what, or really understand like what are the risks and vulnerabilities of voting systems, what is overblown statements on in both directions, and what do we need to do to make things better.
That sounds great. And if people want to find out more information about either Free Speech for People or the symposium, where can they go?
So please come to our website. We have a press release up on that on the website. We just finalized our program, so we have yet to publish it yet, but it's very compelling. So come back to our website, follow us on Blue Sky, follow me on Blue Sky. I'm Susan Greenhalgh, which is Greenhalgh at Blue Sky Social. And you can find the information there. Also follow the Voting Village on X.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks again for being on. I really appreciate it. Good luck with the symposium. I look forward to chatting with you in the fall about what you learned from it and what else we can do to protect our election. So have a great day.
That's great. Thanks.